listening to The Mark Cox Show. Follow the show on Facebook, facebook.com/The Mark Cox Show.
Welcome back into The Mark Cox Show. Annie Fry filling in for Mark. You can follow me on Twitter at Annie Fry Show. Otherwise, make sure you check out 971talk.com/Cox for everything The Mark Cox Show. We just had the Show Me Institute guys in here talking about Missouri problems. We're going to bring in Ted Dabrowski now. He's from the Illinois Policy Institute, and he is here to talk about a couple things that I really want to relay to you listening in the car right now or at home. So, Ted, thank you very much for joining the show. It's good to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I've gotten this question multiple times, and I got the literature in the mail. Proposed amendment to the Illinois Constitution, and it's all blue, and it looks very official, and people are like, I don't know what this means. So can you kind of lay the land out for me and tell me what are we voting on, yes or no? What does a yes vote mean? What does a no vote mean? What's the story here?
Sure. Well, it's kind of an interesting and tricky thing. You know, in Illinois, there's a lot of people who want amendments to the Constitution for things like, you know, how we draw our maps to determine who we vote for, and whether we should have term limits or not to kind of control the mess that we've had in Springfield and in the state. And instead, we ended up with one amendment here, and it's about, you know, how we spend in Illinois our transportation money. And for years, you know, the state has collected transportation money through gas taxes and things like that. But in the end, the legislatures had the freedom to spend it on other stuff. And, you know, you can see that a little bit in our infrastructure in Illinois. Some of it's not very attractive.
Right.
And so there's a whole lobby, and you can imagine that it included contractors and transportation, you know, companies and things like that, who wanted to make sure that whatever money is raised into the transportation fund, or the road fund is what it's called, that it would be spent on infrastructure. Now, that sounds pretty fair, right? If we're going to raise money for infrastructure, we should spend it on infrastructure.
Right.
The only problem is that we're putting something like that into the Constitution. Now, that's not the kind of thing that belongs in a Constitution. Our legislature should be, disciplined enough to spend money that it raises for infrastructure on infrastructure. So it's a little weird. It's hard to go against, but it's also strange that we would have something like this in our Constitution.
Right. I completely agree with you. And it's interesting. My visceral reaction to this is that I want money raised to go where it's supposed to go, but we have a huge crisis in Illinois right now, the pension crisis, and it's untouchable because it's kind of in this lockbox, just like the transportation funds would be if this passed.
Yeah, and so you know what it does is right now pensions has the priority above everything. You know, if we want to fund social services, if we want to take care of our poor, disadvantaged, if we want to put a little bit more in education, well, you know what? We can't because pensions is sucking up all that money. Now imagine we create another lockbox, now just for transportation. Suddenly we got these two things that are kind of dominating the finances, and it's locking everybody's hands. I understand why some people voted for this, but it's just another weird thing to complicate how Illinois does business.
Yeah, I agree, and it's interesting to think that if you the contrary to saying yes, put it in the lockbox, is saying no, we trust our legislators' judgment to use the funds according to the best benefit of the people of Illinois. And it's hard to say even that these days, that you could actually entrust them with this type of responsibility because everything has been handled so irresponsibly for so long.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right. You know, we haven't had a balanced budget since 2001. You know, we spend more money than we take in pretty much every year. And so, like you said, we can understand why anybody would be skeptical. By the same token, how the heck did this one thing, right, how did this one amendment related to transportation funds get on there? And it just raises a lot of question about the lobbying that's required to get that on there. Big business loves this kind of thing, right? You know, fund my big transportation projects and, you know, pay me lots of money. So it's a tricky one, and it's not an easy one for anybody to take a position on. So I understand the confusion and why you get lots of questions.
Right. So it is an interesting way to look at it too, because this type of a lockbox where you raise the transportation funds through things that fees, motor fuel taxes, vehicle registration fees, other things that have to do with highways and roads and all that stuff. You raise these fees. Does it go to benefit the people of Illinois, or skeptically, as a citizen of Illinois, I'm wondering, does this go to benefit friends of people like Mike Madigan who have buddies that are contractors that are going to be guaranteed this kind of money in the future. I don't necessarily have the utmost trust that putting this money aside and making it untouchable is really for the people's benefit rather than the political benefit of those who are allowing this one amendment to see the voters on November 8th.
Well, I think that's the sad part. We know that no matter where money goes in Illinois, it tends to fall into corrupt hands. I think we've got a pretty good reputation for that, sadly. But that said, here we got an amendment like this, but when we try to reform pensions, we can't get that done. When we try to put spending limits on this government, we can't get that done. So the stuff that we really need to protect taxpayers, to bring down, we have the nation's highest property taxes. We'd like to get those things through a property tax freeze done, and we can't yet. Somehow, on big transportation type deals, it looks like they won out.
Yeah, somehow or another, this has become of the utmost priority in a state where pretty much everywhere you turn around, there's disarray. And to pivot here a little bit, but to also talk about the disarray that does exist in Illinois, there was a poll done by the Paul Simon Institute, and it found that 47% of people that they surveyed want to leave Illinois. And 57% of millennials and 58% of people 35 to 50. The thing that struck me the most about that age group, those are the people who are going to be paying the most taxes in the next couple decades to help Illinois get out of the mess that it's in. If those people leave, what is Illinois going to do?
Well, Annie, I've been saying that for a while now, that I went to Detroit a few years ago when they went bankrupt, and the biggest lesson I learned from them was they said, respect your taxpayers. And we totally disrespect our taxpayers, and like you say, the millennials are the core taxpayers of the next couple decades. If we chase them away, we've got a huge hole in our economy. And we've seen these kind of numbers in the past. Lots of people wanting to leave, and a lot of people are quick to poo-poo on the numbers and say, oh, it's of course we have bad weather and things like that. But we've tracked the migration numbers, and people leave. A lot of people go to Texas, a lot of them go to Florida, California, but there's a whole bunch of people. They go to Indiana, they go to Wisconsin, they go even to Missouri, right? I mean, so we're losing out. Illinois loses out its people to all states in the nation practically, and so it's kind of a message. People are starting to connect the dots that the corruption, the taxes, the pensions, Mike Madigan, all those things end up meaning something like, maybe my future's not here in Illinois. I may have to leave. And that's what the big thing we have to change, and that comes first by respecting taxpayers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm raising 3 children in Illinois. My husband and I are both from Illinois, born and raised across the river from St. Louis. And I have to say, when I talk about, if I'm talking about Illinois politics, or maybe there's a new tax that gets put out, or an election year comes around, when I talk about it, and I'm working here in Missouri, people look at me and they say, why are you still there? And I say it's because it's my home. Generationally speaking, it's my home. But there's going to be a point where it's not the best thing for the future of my family to have to be put under this just massive burden. And when I leave it all behind. That is not, if I decided to move next week to Missouri, I could continue my job, I could continue my life, and I leave all of Illinois behind. I don't need to give them anything anymore, but their problems are still going to exist. And when the taxpayers leave, the tax burden still exists, the debt still exists, the pensions that are unfunded still exist, and people are still going to not get what they've been promised by these politicians. And I don't even know what the solution is. Do you have a solution?
It starts a cycle, right? Because if the taxpayers leave, and like you said, the burden is still there, and there's fewer taxpayers left, well, that means they got to get taxed even more, and so that spurs more people to leave. So it just creates a vicious cycle that you can't get out of. But I think, I think our politicians forget, and for the older crowd, it's hard to move, right? You want to stay. You've had your whole family in Illinois forever. Your history's there, but for the up and comer millennials, this is a global world now. It's a mobile world, and they're not tied in the same way that the older generation is. So, I think that's the thing that we have to be most cautious about is chasing away the future and the youth.
So we have an amendment on the ballot on November 8th to try to figure out where to put transportation funds. What can we do for taxpayers in Illinois to secure their future, to actually, for once, put these taxpayers first?
Well, I think it's going to start, and something we're going to be pushing is a property tax freeze. Believe it or not, but there's so much that revolves around how much spending goes on at the local level that drives spending at the state level. And so a lot of that starts with freezing how much we spend at the local level so that we don't have so many units of local government, such big bureaucracies to pay for those, all these, baggage handlers for superintendents, and, we just have way too many public sector employees, and they're really, really expensive. So with the property tax freeze and some other comprehensive work around that, we start to control the size of government and the expenditures, and again begin to respect taxpayers. And I think that's a starting point.
I agree with you. We're talking to Ted Dabrowski with the Illinois Policy Institute. You can see everything they crank out at illinoispolicy.org. Last thing I want to talk to you about is this proposition for a taxpayer bill of rights. Can you kind of explain to me what that would mean from an individual citizen's perspective? What would a taxpayer bill of rights mean to me?
Well, wow, this is one of those where you respect taxpayers by a government has a spending limit. And, any government that exists should have limits on how much it spends. It shouldn't just be able to spend whatever it wants, and that's the case we have in many governments. They borrow without telling you. They borrow tons of money, and then you have to pay it back later. They move money around from different funds and don't tell you about it. So what it means is you put a spending limit, and you call things like debt. You don't call it revenues. You call it borrowing, and you limit those kind of things. And what it does is you allow spending at the government level to grow at something like inflation or population, but not in some crazy path, crazy rate that often happens. And you put the taxpayer first.
That's music to my ears. That doesn't feel like Illinois now, but what I tell my Missouri friends when they tell me why should I move, I tell them because I love my home. I love Illinois. I love everything about Illinois except for the corrupt politicians that are running it and making it this cesspool where I don't feel like my efforts, the hard work that I put in and the hard work my husband puts in to help raise our family, it just goes right out the door.
Oh.
And it's hard to make a home in a place where the government doesn't respect the taxpayer. So something like a taxpayer bill of rights, it really speaks to me and it gives me hope.
Yeah, my parents immigrated here in the 50s and 60s, and this place was a beacon. Even we had our corruption back then, but it was a beacon of opportunity, and people came from all over the world, right? And Illinois is still that great state with its water and its infrastructure and its education facilities and agriculture. It's still that. It's just got a totally messed up and corrupt political system, and so we need to flip that and get back Illinois to being that beacon of prosperity. There's no reason why we are not a great state in this country.
Yep. Ted Dabrowski with the Illinois Policy Institute, thank you very much for joining us today on the Mark Cox Show. It's very good to hear somebody talk about hope for Illinois. I would liken it a little bit to let's make Illinois great again. I would appreciate that very much. You can follow everything at illinoispolicy.org that they put out. It's great stuff. And you can also follow them on Twitter at Illinois Policy and on Facebook, Illinois Policy Institute. Just search it in there. It's easy to find. We'll be back right after this. I'm going to